3 more jabs. Nope, still not fast enough. This time, though, Forrest was thrusting 4 times per second, but even that wasn't cutting it. The crowd kept sneaking glances his way, amazed at how not only was he picking up this technique on the fly, but he seemed to have already mastered it. Maybe it was his obsession, or maybe his borderline crazy determination. But whatever it was, the dude was nuts. Watching Forrest go all out lit a fire under everyone else. There was no way they were going to let a student show them up. Suddenly, the fatigue disappeared, and everyone's morale hit an all-time high. Before long, Forrest had taken down a few more zombies, but he quickly realized that 5 thrusts per second seemed to be his current limit. Besides, during this time, he'd already cleared out most of the nearby trash mobs. Now all that was left was the zombie leader. With a sharp swoosh, Forrest dashed forward, unleashing his wrathful rainstorm. The zombie leader raised its arms, ready to block, but Forrest thrust 5 rapid strikes. This time, though, it felt like he was hitting solid steel. Every hit echoed with the sound of metal clashing. Damn it, he thought. This thing had actually evolved. The zombie leader grinned menacingly. Forrest quickly retreated, sizing up the situation. While he knew this zombie wasn't as powerful overall as the Wolf King he'd faced before, something was different now. He activated his eyes of analysis, revealing that the zombie leader had indeed evolved to Tier 3. Not only could it summon Tier 1 and 2 zombies, to make matters worse, it had gained a nasty new ability, hardened skin. Forrest gritted his teeth. There was no choice left but to go all in. Charging forward again, he struck, but just like before, his attacks bounced off, dealing no damage. Meanwhile, he had to dodge the zombies' counterattacks like his life depended on it, which, well, it kinda did. If he didn't take out this boss fast, it would keep summoning more zombies, and things would spiral out of control really quickly. Taking a deep breath, Forrest decided it was time to go all out. He activated explosive anger, ready to go all out. Everyone could sense the sudden surge in his power. This was it, the real deal. With his explosive anger paired with wrathful rainstorm, his speed shot through the roof, and his strength ramped up too. This time, his attacks finally started doing some damage. In his berserk state, not only did his base stats get a boost, but he even felt like he'd reached a new level of synergy with his weapon. He sped up his strikes, and each one pricked straight through the zombie's body. The team captain couldn't believe what she was seeing. Was that just one hit? But why was it so strong? From the outside, it looked like Forrest had only thrusted once. In reality, though, he'd landed a flurry of strikes, so fast that they all blurred into one. This time, Forrest finally took down the Tier 3 zombie leader, earning a hefty 8,000 experience points and leveling up to 13. Not bad. He quickly dumped all his potential points into strength, ready to take on the rest of the zombies in one go. The system notifications started popping up like crazy. Experience points were pouring in. In just a few moments, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen zombies. His teammates collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but alive. Not only had they survived, but they'd also made some breakthroughs, and they had Forrest to thank for it. As the explosive anger effect wore off, Forrest fell into a weakened state, but he just chuckled. Looks like we're brothers for life now, huh? The captain, however, was a little concerned. She couldn't help but wonder if Forrest had used some kind of forbidden drug to boost his strength earlier. After all, those things had serious side effects. She raised an eyebrow and asked, "Did you take something?" Forrest quickly waved his hands, explaining it was just his technique. Curious, the captain asked, "But what about that last thrust he made before killing the zombie leader? The power was off the charts, even though it was the same skill. How did that happen?" Forrest scratched his head, honestly a bit clueless. All he remembers is during that moment it just felt like he and his silver phantom spear were in perfect sync. The captain's eyes widened in realization. Forrest must have unlocked a hidden mastery. Forrest looked confused. She explained, "It's more commonly known as enlightenment, is when a person is able to unleash the technique's full potential. Even the most basic bronze-level technique, when mastered, can be as powerful as a silver level. But very few people could ever achieve this." Forrest wasn't entirely sure whether if he reached enlightenment or not. But if he had, did that mean his wrathful rainstorm could hit with the power of a gold level? Now that was something to get excited about. By this point, the sky had grown dark, and the captain decided it was best for everyone to head back to the rooftop of the building for the night. Before long, they had a fire going and were prepping dinner. Tonight's special? Tier 3 Wolf King meat. Forrest chowed down eagerly, realizing this was his first time eating an evolved beast. As he stuffed his face, the captain explained, "Some evolved beasts have meat that not only tastes great, but also doesn't carry any viruses or infections." It was clear the captain had been through her fair share of training out in the wild, so Forrest decided to ask her something that had been on his mind. Asking her if she had heard of the sanctuary, the captain raised an eyebrow, thought for a moment, and told him he must have meant the Sanctuary Academy. It's the most elite martial arts academy. Every student there is considered a prodigy. Forrest's eyes widened as it finally clicked. When Laura mentioned the sanctuary, she was talking about a school. But what is the minimum requirement to enroll there? Well, a person must graduate as a second-tier martial artist before enrolling. Everyone was starting to realize just how intense that academy must be. Thinking of Laura, Forrest smiled to himself. He didn't think reaching Tier 2 was all that difficult. In fact, he was sure it was only a matter of time. He couldn't help but wonder, when he became a high-level martial artist and stood in front of Laura again, would her usual icy expression crack into one of surprise? Morning came, and the captain laid out the plan for the day. They would continue clearing out zombies and evolved beasts in the central area. Once they wrapped up, it was finally time to head home. Simple enough, right? Well, that was until one of the guys suddenly pointed off into the distance. "What the heck is that thing?" Everyone looked up, and sure enough, perched on a distant building was a strange creature. Forrest used his eyes of analysis to take a closer look. It's a Tier 2 zombie, the crawler. He then tells everyone that if they get bitten, they will turn into one of those things too. The crawlers were lying flat across the tops of buildings, creeping along painfully slowly. Bruiser, watching them, couldn't help but smirk. "They're so slow." Then raising his laser gun, Forrest tried to stop him. "Wait, don't shoot!" But it was too late. Bruiser fired a shot, but the crawler dodged it effortlessly. Bruiser was shocked. The creature had moved so fast it looked like it had teleported. Forrest tried to tell him that crawlers aren't as simple as they look. They're actually really fast, and all that slow creeping around? It's bait. They do it on purpose to lure in prey. The crawler turned its head toward the squad below, and suddenly, more of them began stirring from the buildings around them. One by one, they started moving, their movements growing faster and faster. The captain shouted for everyone to get ready, and everyone grabbed their weapons. The crawlers rushed at them at incredible speed, and while the squad managed to gun down a bunch of them, it wasn't long before a few broke through the line. The captain was quick on the draw, pulling out her weapon and taking one out. The rest of the squad dove into close combat, fighting off the remaining crawlers. But then, out of nowhere, one of the creatures pounced from above, sinking its teeth into a squad member before anyone could react. The captain's face went pale as she glanced toward him. To make matters worse, even more crawlers were now leaping down from the surrounding buildings. The battle zone was shrinking fast. After Forrest drove his spear through another zombie's skull, he realized it was time to retreat. "We need to get out of here! Find an open area!" he called out. The captain quickly agreed, and the squad began their retreat, with Forrest and the captain covering the rear. It wasn't long before they found an open clearing, but the crawlers were relentless, quickly surrounding them again. There was no choice. They had to fight their way out. The squad charged back into the fray, battling for what felt like hours. By the end, everyone was completely exhausted, collapsing onto the ground. Finally, the crawlers were dead. Forrest grabbed his water bottle and took a huge gulp, wiping his mouth. "If it weren't for the experience points, no way I'd work this hard," he muttered with a grin. Just then, a flash of sword energy came flying at him. Forrest barely dodged in time, spinning around and instinctively thrusting his spear backward. But the attacker blocked it with ease, smiling beneath his hood. Forrest's eyes of analysis kicked in, identifying the man as a Tier 3, specializing in assassination and evasion. His name? Shadow. Forrest pointed his spear at him, questioning who sent him. Shadow didn't bother answering. In his eyes, Forrest was as good as dead, but before he could make a move, the rest of the squad stood up, surrounding him in a heartbeat. Shadow just chuckled, completely unbothered, telling them his target is only Forrest. If they don't want to die, they should get lost. The captain didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward. "Forrest is a federal soldier. If you touch him, you're declaring war on the Federation." Shadow sneered and launched a swift attack at the captain. She responded with her own technique, but in the blink of an eye, she was sent flying, crashing hard into the ground. The rest of the team watched in shock. Then without hesitation, they all charged at Shadow, but Shadow wasn't fazed. With a smirk, he unleashed a silver-level technique, creating a whirlwind that kept everyone at bay. It was only then that the team realized just how powerful he was. A third-tier martial artist. Seeing this, Forrest suddenly turned and bolted towards the city. Shadow, watching him run, assumed Forrest was scared for his life, abandoning his teammates. Coward, he thought. However, to him, that just made the hunt even more fun. In the next second, Shadow darted after Forrest, disappearing into the distance. "Who the hell is that guy?" one of the team members yelled. Not far away, the captain, still catching her breath, slowly stood up. That last attack had shown her just how big the gap was between them. Even as strong as Forrest was, she couldn't be sure he'd be able to beat this guy. The rest of the team quickly realized the same thing. Forrest wasn't running away because he was scared. He was drawing the assassin away to keep them safe. Were they really just going to stand here and watch? The captain grabbed her sword, anger flaring in her eyes. He dares mess with one of our soldiers? Oh, he's going to regret that. Meanwhile, in the city, Shadow had caught up with Forrest. Or rather, Forrest had stopped and was waiting for him. A grin spread across Forrest's face, asking the man if he really thought he was running. He stares at Shadow like he is an idiot. Turned out, he just wanted to find a quiet spot to finish this. Shadow's face twisted with rage. Forrest had hit a nerve while pointing out that Shadow must have been sent by the Stryker family. Shadow didn't bother to deny it. Shadow then growled, asking if Forrest thinks he's going to survive long enough to get revenge. Forrest chuckled, saying he's not just going to survive, he's going to kill him right here. Without warning, Forrest lunged forward, his spear thrusting straight at Shadow. Shadow's eyes narrowed as he barely dodged, the tip of the spear grazing his cheek. He hadn't expected Forrest to be this fast. Shadow quickly moved behind him, but something made him hesitate for a split second. The sudden wave of killing intent that radiated from Forrest had thrown him off. Forrest, sensing Shadow behind him, smirked. He knew Shadow was using some kind of high-level movement technique. In a flash, the two clashed again. Forrest's spear grazed Shadow's waist, while Shadow's dagger sliced through a few strands of Forrest's hair. After several rapid exchanges, Forrest spotted his chance. He dodged Shadow's attack, then thrust his spear forward. Shadow barely managed to jump back a few steps. You've got some skills," Shadow said, a sneer forming on his face. "Too bad it's nowhere near enough." Deciding to stop playing around, Shadow leaped into the air, his daggers flashing as he activated another technique. Every strike was lightning fast. While some of those attacks were real, others were just feints. But what surprised Shadow was that Forrest didn't bother dodging. Instead, he charged forward, spear aimed directly at him. Forrest unleashed a flurry of strikes, the spear stabbing forward in rapid succession. The next moment, both of them were thrown back several meters from the impact. Shadow had seen this move before. In fact, he'd been watching Forrest carefully ever since he was killing those zombie crawlers. Once again, Shadow launched his attack, but it was frustrating. He was a tier 3, and yet it felt like he was getting nowhere with Forrest, who was only first tier. Forrest, for his part, seemed completely unfazed. Instead, he was enjoying the challenge. Without a word, Forrest launched another wrathful rainstorm. This time, Shadow was ready. He countered every strike effortlessly, then closed in, raising his daggers to strike at Forrest's shoulders. The force of the impact sent Forrest crashing into a wall. Thinking it was over, Shadow allowed himself a satisfied grin. But when he looked back at Forrest, he saw something unexpected, a playful smile on Forrest's face. Confused, Shadow followed his gaze and looked down. That's when he noticed the blood spreading across his own abdomen. He couldn't understand it. He dodged Forrest's 4 strikes. So how had he been injured? Before he could even piece it together, his clothes were soaked in blood. Forrest had known Shadow was lurking in the shadows all along, so Forrest had been holding back on purpose, biding his time. "Who said I could only strike 4 times in a second?" Forrest said with a grin. Shadow's face paled. There was no way he could have known Forrest's system automatically displayed the information of anyone nearby, letting Forrest see through his every move from the start. That 5th strike, it was the finishing blow. A gift for Shadow. He gritted his teeth, but it didn't help, the blood pouring out from his belly. A second later, his body went limp and he collapsed to the ground. The system notified him of defeating a Tier 3 martial artist, gained 120,000 experience, which helped Forrest level up to 14. but before he could celebrate, he realized something. He wasn't doing so hot himself. He quickly allocated his potential points, adding 4 to strength and the rest to vitality. The level up helped restore some stamina, but the dagger wounds still kept bleeding. He needed to stop the blood loss fast, but everything around him was starting to blur. Just before passing out, he could have sworn he heard someone calling his name. A moment later, the captain and the squad came rushing over. These guys really are my brothers. Surprised to see them despite the danger of a Tier 3 enemy. Then everything went black. Who knows how much time had passed, but Forrest finally woke up, his entire body wrapped in bandages. Slowly, he opened his eyes and stepped out of the tent. To his surprise, they were back on the rooftop where they had rested earlier. The captain noticed him right away and walked over, asking how he was feeling. Then she handed him a bowl of meat stew. The rest of the squad gathered around, still in awe. They couldn't believe Forrest actually took down Shadow. The captain nodded, added that Shadow was also a wanted assassin, and Forrest gonna get quite the bounty when they get back. Forrest's shoulders were still a mess, but he needed at least a day before he could move properly again. So, the team decided to stay put and rest for the day before continuing their cleanup mission. After a meal, everyone settled down, and time passed quickly. Fast forward a month, and the area around them was littered with the remains of countless zombies. After weeks of hard work, they'd finally cleared the place. One of the team members shook his head and sighed. Wonder which unlucky fools will have to come back here next year. The captain couldn't help but think the same. If it hadn't been for Forrest, the entire team might have been wiped out. In this 1 month, everyone had come to fully respect the kid. Now, they were brothers forged in battle. Just then, a group of strangers started walking toward them. The man leading them scanned Forrest's team with a strange grin plastered across his face. Even though it was obvious that Forrest and his crew were Federation soldiers, the man arrogantly told them to hand over everything they had. The captain's eyes narrowed as she took in their hostile demeanor, asking who gave him the guts to try and rob Federation soldiers. Forrest didn't say anything at first, using his eyes of analysis to size them up. Most of the group were just first-tier martial artists, but there's a red-haired guy in the back that caught his attention. He turned out to be a third-tier martial artist, carrying a massive greatsword. Soon, Forrest quietly relayed this to the captain. The red-haired man smirked and shoved his men aside, making his way toward Forrest, greatsword in hand. "This one's mine," he said, pointing directly at Forrest. "The rest of them? Do whatever you want with them." When the captain saw the red-haired man up close, her expression turned serious. She recognized him immediately. This was the lone wolf, the same guy who had massacred an entire battalion. The captain didn't back down. Instead, she drew her weapon, ready to fight. But the red-haired man just sneered at her, as if killing Federation soldiers was no more difficult than slaughtering animals. His arrogance was infuriating, and the captain's anger flared. But Forrest stepped in front of her, signaling that he would handle this alone. It was clear to Forrest that this guy had also been hired by the Stryker family. When Forrest mentioned Shadow, the red-haired man simply scoffed, telling him to not compare him to that idiot. Sure, they are both Tier 3, but the difference in their strength is like night and day. With that, he swung his massive greatsword down in a brutal strike. Forrest quickly jumped back, narrowly avoiding the blow, but he could feel the force behind it. The weight of that sword was even heavier than his silver phantom, meaning the red-haired man's raw strength was no joke. As the red-haired man pressed his attack, swinging the sword with deadly precision, the captain ordered the others to focus on taking down the rest of the enemy crew. Chaos erupted as the two groups clashed. Meanwhile, Forrest tried to counter with Wrathful Rainstorm, however, each of his strikes was blocked with ease. The red-haired man smirked, questioning Forrest if he thinks he can beat him with that. The dude went on yapping about how Forrest needs to strike 10 times a second before he can even scratch him. Raising his greatsword high, he prepared to show Forrest what real power looked like. With a thunderous roar, he unleashed a terrifying attack, the kind of technique only a Tier 3 warrior could use. Forrest barely had time to react. Realizing there was no way to dodge, he activated explosive anger and braced for impact, meeting the strike head-on. The explosion of power sent dust and debris flying everywhere. The captain and the rest of the team anxiously turned their attention to Forrest, fearing the worst. The red-haired man chuckled, assuming Forrest had been obliterated by the blow. But as the dust settled, Forrest emerged from the cloud of smoke, battered but still standing. A look of surprise flickered across the red-haired man's face. "What? Did you take some kind of forbidden drug?" he asked, a twisted grin forming. Doesn't matter. This just makes things even more interesting. The red-haired man charged at Forrest again, and despite Forrest's explosive anger, he could tell his strength still wasn't enough. This guy had to be at the peak of a Tier 3 martial artist. With one powerful strike, the red-haired man knocked Forrest back. Gathering his strength, the red-haired man infused his greatsword with energy, preparing another technique. Forrest felt a surge of danger, but it was too late to dodge. He raised his spear to block, but the first blow sent him flying. Coughing, Forrest glanced down at his silver phantom, crafted from a rare meteorite. To his shock, the weapon now had a deep crack. Before he could recover, the second strike came, even more devastating than the first. Forrest knew he couldn't hold back any longer. There was no room for playing it safe. He unleashed Wrathful Rainstorm again, much to the red-haired man's amusement. "That's not going to work," he sneered. But this time, Forrest poured all his energy into the spear. In an instant, flames began to swirl around it. His wings of 100 birds, which is a growth-type technique, had grown stronger over the past month and had evolved into a silver-level skill. To his surprise, Forrest realized he could combine it with Wrathful Rainstorm. The red-haired man hesitated for just a moment but didn't back down. Their weapons clashed, and a massive explosion shook the ground. Forrest was sent flying once again, but this time, the red-haired man wasn't unscathed either. He was knocked back several meters, his clothes charred from the fire. Despite the damage, a smile crept onto his face. Turned out, his technique have a total of 3 strikes, and each is stronger than the last. Lifting his greatsword once more. "This is my 3rd slash, and my strongest one yet." As the red-haired man unleashed his final blow, Forrest felt the overwhelming pressure of the attack bearing down on him. But instead of panicking, he found himself unusually calm. At that moment, he remembered the feeling he had when he killed the zombie leader, the sensation of everything slowing down, of being in perfect sync with his spear. Was he once again standing at the edge of life and death? That same feeling of unity with his weapon washed over him, as if time itself had stopped. Forrest gripped his spear tightly, his senses sharpened, and for the second time, he touched the mystical realm of oneness between man and weapon. With a swift movement, he unleashed the Wrathful Rainstorm. In the blink of an eye, he was already behind the red-haired man. No one saw what happened. Not even the red-haired man himself, who stood frozen mid-swing, disbelief etched on his face. How is this possible?" he muttered, still trying to process what had just happened. It was the same move, yet something was different. Slowly, he glanced down at his chest, which was now riddled with holes, his body utterly pierced. A second later, his massive frame crumpled to the ground. Soon, the system notified, defeated Tier 3 martial artists. Leveled up to 15, but Forrest barely registered the system's voice as everything went black, and he passed out on the spot. When he woke up, his head was pounding. He groaned and slowly opened his eyes, noticing the captain sitting beside him. She said he's been out for a day, with a smile. She tells him they are on the airship, heading back. At the same time, she handed him a card, and Forrest, confused, asked, "What's this?" 3 million Federation coins, she explained. "It's the reward for taking down Shadow and the Lone Wolf, which she helped apply for it." Forrest's eyes lit up with excitement. 3 million. That was more than enough to upgrade his gear, but before he could say anything, the captain muttered quietly, "You know, I've been the one taking care of you all this time, and I even applied for the reward. Aren't you going to say something?" Scratching the back of his head awkwardly, Forrest stammered, Thank you, Captain." The captain's eyes twinkled mischievously, asking how about Forrest repay her with himself, leaning in with a playful smile. Forrest froze for a moment, completely caught off guard, saying he's still just a student, looking dead serious. The captain blinked in surprise, then burst into laughter. "I was joking, you blockhead." She couldn't believe how dense Forrest was. They chatted for a while longer, and soon Forrest realized what day it was. Final exams were coming up fast. He needed to get back as soon as possible. The captain waved it off, telling him they still had 2 more hours until they landed. When they finally arrived at the airfield, the officer gathered everyone. The group was noticeably smaller than before. With a solemn tone, he reported on the status of each squad. Those who survived received medals, a symbol of honor reserved for Federation soldiers. The medals also came with some perks in their daily lives. When it was Forrest's turn, the instructor gave him a nod of approval. saying his performance was the best this time. Thanks to Forrest, his squad had the highest survival rate. Not to mention, he took down several Tier 3 evolved beasts, and 2 wanted criminals. Hearing the officer's praise, all the other soldiers turned to look at Forrest with a mix of admiration and curiosity. He could tell that Forrest was already on the verge of becoming a Tier 2 martial artist, but his true strength far surpassed that. With a grin, he extended an invitation. "Why don't you consider joining the Federation as a full-fledged soldier? With your abilities, it wouldn't be long before you rise through the ranks and become a high-ranking officer." To his surprise, Forrest shook his head. He wants to first focus on his academics, and he'd rather go to college for now. The instructor paused, as if only just remembering that Forrest was still in school. Then he burst out laughing, clapping Forrest on the shoulder. Well, if Forrest ever changes his mind after he graduates, he can also come to him. Watching the interaction, the captain smiled. So young, yet already able to take down a Tier 3 martial artist, she thought. How is she supposed to win this kid over? Forrest's teammates, knowing he was leaving soon, came forward one by one to hug him and say their goodbyes. Of course, the captain wasn't about to miss her chance either. She pulled Forrest in for a tight hug, pressing him against her bowing. Yep, that part. Forrest's face immediately turned red, and the captain laughed heartily. Who would have thought? The kid who slayed enemies left and right on the battlefield can actually get shy. Forrest, flustered, awkwardly smiled back. The captain patted his shoulder once more. "Thanks again for everything, Forrest. Don't forget about us, all right?"